Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media production. Today, we are talking about emulating drum sounds that you hear on recordings and in life with the drums you have without starting from the ground up. We spend a fair amount of time here trying to emulate and really reproduce sometimes very specific drum sounds that we hear on recordings, and what follows is the prescription that we use here pretty much every day. When we imagine a drum sound, we can think of it like a recipe, like we need to have the right ingredients in the exact proportions in order to get this imagined sound that we're looking for, and the fact of the matter is, this is not the case. There's such an extraordinary amount of wiggle room when it comes to tuning and tone and the very drums and heads that we have in front of us that there's plenty to explore there that's going to get us where we need to go without completely having to start over. We are specifically staying away from tuning, tensions, drum dial settings, any of that stuff, because you don't need that information in order to emulate sounds that you've heard. The sounds are in the drums and we're going to use our ears to get us there. We are going to be utilizing information that has come up in past videos that we've created over the course of this channel, and this includes things like ear training, sounds through the decades, understanding the relationship between batter and reso heads on all of these drums, and a little bit of standard sort of run-of-the-mill ear training to get us into the idea of intervals, what they're going to do for us, and the ranges of these drums that will actually give us a good sound. There's a handful of things that can turn into speed bumps for us in the process of what we're about to do. The first one that we definitely want to mention is just knowing your gear, understanding the sizes of your drums, the heads and the sticks that you're using, what they're capable of, so that you're not reaching for something that's outside of what that particular drum can possibly do. The other big elephant in the room is we do need to be able to use our ears to follow a sound and know if we're getting closer or further away from that. These things take practice, a little bit of ear training, a little bit of the time. Over time, we'll train your ears to understand where you're at and know how to get where you're trying to go. Step one of the process is picking a reference track. What are the sounds that we're trying to emulate? Doesn't need to be isolated drums, can be anything at all. We just need to make sure that we know what part of the drum set we want to be emulating and make sure that we can hear those drums clearly. One really important thing to state at this moment is that when we listen to recorded drums, there's an awful lot going on in terms of production and post-production on those sounds. So we need to be able to identify things like compression or maybe dramatic EQ, reverb, things like this that are not really recreatable with an acoustic set of drums in front of us. This is why we've adhered so closely over the years to giving you completely unadulterated drum sounds so that we start to set a baseline for what it means to listen to drums that haven't had all of that done to them in production and post-production. If you're detecting elements like this in the reference recording that you're going to be trying to emulate, do your best to discount those parts of the sound and try to zone in on just the part of the sound that is the drum itself. Once we've decided what we want to try to copy with our own drums, we've got to start taking this apart. Step two is understanding articulation and understanding the decay of those sounds as well. The articulation can include trying to identify what implements they might have been using when they were hitting the drum, how aggressively they're hitting it. Are they playing rim shots? Does it sound like they're playing really gently and maybe a much more breathy kind of sound out of the drum? All of this contributes to being able to design a sound with your own drums that's going to get you similar articulation so that you can then start to address the rest of the sound. One of the biggest things that's going to be affecting the articulation is whether or not and how much muffling is present on the drum. A lot of the time, players that we talk to think of muffling as manipulating the sustain and the decay and the overtones and things like that, but it really impacts the articulation. So if you're hearing a lot of clarity in the sound, or if it sounds super muffled, there's a lot to take into account as far as that goes. In terms of the overall pitch and the fundamental pitch of each of the drums, it's worth taking that into account, though it doesn't mean that we have to emulate it exactly. It's more about considering if it's in the high range, the medium range, or the low range, and starting with that direction. As for the decay of the drum sound, there are overtones to listen for in terms of the way that they fall off. How long does the fundamental tone last? How sort of falling off is it going? Is it doing a pitch bend kind of thing? There's a lot of aspects that can live in everything after that attack. We want to take those things into account because subtle adjustments are going to give us more or less of all of those things. When we talk about sustain and decay, we also need to take into account things beyond the central sound of the drum. For instance, in the snare drum, there is a certain amount of decay that lives only in the snare wires that we want to take into account because we're going to be adjusting those tensions to get us closer to the sound we want. In the toms, we might be experiencing growl or pitch bend in their decay, and in the bass drum, we might be getting a really strong fundamental note that carries longer or shorter depending on what we're looking for. Now that we have a good sense of the reference track and the sound that we're trying to achieve, it's time to start manipulating the sound of our drum set. But again, without touching a drum key, we want to do everything we can before we start to adjust tuning to see how close we can get. At this juncture, this can include various kinds of muffling, placing things on top of the drums. It could mean removing muffling if we have too much on different parts of the kit and need more articulation or a different kind of sustain. This could also be a possible take the pillow all the way out of the bass drum or put a much larger pillow in the bass drum. Again, without changing tuning because there's a lot we can do before we start to go down that rabbit hole. Something that I came relatively late to in my playing is discovering that a lot of drum sounds that I loved on recordings were not actually played with traditional drumsticks, and that means for us that having some options for implements to hit them with may actually get us the sound we're looking for, where normally we would just chase it with sticks forever and not actually get there. This means bundle rods, it could mean mallets, it could mean brooms, it could mean playing with your hands. The world is our oyster, we can do whatever we want, so if it's all about the sound, it means that all of these options are on the table. Now that we've run the gamut of all the possibilities before doing any tuning, it's time to address the parts of the sound that can only be repaired through a little bit of tuning. It could be that the snare is in the medium range and it needs to be in the high range. Only tuning is going to get us there. Similarly, the rack tom is a little bit high and we need it to be punchier and lower. Let's tune it a little bit punchier and lower. The important thing here is that we've defined the character of the drums, and if we need to make adjustments to the pitch, that's available to us. But if we start with a drum key, we're getting way far away from the possibility that the character of the drums might actually already be pretty close. And exploring that before we change the range of everything can shorten the process an awful lot, especially if it turns out that we were already pretty close. Now at this juncture, we have to do a little bit of fine-tuning to get us over that last hump and into exactly what we're looking for. For example, at this point is where I might start messing around with the tension on the snare wires, because now I've changed a bunch of stuff and it's highly likely that the tension that sounded all right at an earlier tuning is not working at this tuning. So don't be afraid to check it out, micro adjustments, make micro adjustments to really any part of the kit, because at this point, we're 99% of the way there. At this point, we've arrived at the sound that we're looking for. We do have to take into account that our reference track may again have effects or reverbs, different things on it that will change the sound we hear on the recording relative to what we have in the room, but we aren't looking for a recorded sound. We're looking for the sound of real drums as close as we can get to the drums that are on that recording. What we've been through together today is the exact process that we do here all the time, whether we've got a new drum set in that we're checking out or if we're trying to demonstrate a certain kind of sound on the drum set that we use every day. This is proof positive that having settings, having tensions, having whatever you might find on a forum that's trying to get you to a certain sound is wholly unnecessary. What you need is a reference point, your ears, and a certain amount of practice to understand what it takes to get into the ballpark and then ultimately to the exact sound that you hear when you're trying to emulate your favorite recordings. This is ear training. This is not rocket science. It just takes practice like anything else. And, if you practice playing for a certain amount of the time during the day, practicing things like this, even just with a snare drum, is worth the time because it all folds back in on itself and helps us to make the sound that we're looking for. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. If you liked what you saw, please follow the link below to the Patreon. Check out everything else we have to offer there. Still very psyched about the Cymbal series. Got anecdotes, got lots of great stuff over there. Also, please like, comment, subscribe, and tell us your stories about going after a certain sound, especially if you got it without buying anything new that was added on, heads, sticks, whatever.